He was trained to protect her. She never imagined she'd have to fight for him. She hadn't spoken since they brought her in. Not when they asked her name, not when they offered her water, not when they said they needed to sort things out. She simply sat, staring at a crack in the floor, eyes unfocused, as if watching something far away. Her silence wasn't confusion. It was the kind of silence that comes after something breaks inside and hasn't found a way to piece itself back together yet. Just hours earlier, the sky had been clear. The late afternoon sun spilled across the sidewalks of Oak Ridge, painting soft shadows between the trees. Sophia clipped the leash onto Max's collar like she did every day. He stood still as always, calm and alert, his silver-gray coat catching the sunlight. Max was more than a dog. He was her protector, her constant, the last promise her father had made good on after her mother died. With her father away again on deployment, Max had become her lifeline. Their walk that day had started like all the others, quiet and familiar, a routine that gave her some control over a world that often spun without warning. The cruiser appeared without sound, rolling slow beside the curb. Sophia noticed it instantly. Her father had taught her to be aware, to watch for details. The car passed, then circled back. This time it stopped. Two officers stepped out, one older, heavy-set with cold eyes, the other younger, rigid, expressionless. "You live around here?" the older one asked. Sophia answered respectfully. Her voice was soft but clear, her posture straight. She didn't fidget. Max stood by her left side, relaxed but attentive. Things turned quickly. The younger officer, Miller, fixated on Max, questioning his size, his temperament. Sophia explained Max was trained, calm, never a threat. But Miller's tone shifted, his stance too close, his fingers near his weapon. Max moved slightly in front of her. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply positioned himself between her and the man, making her uncomfortable. "Control your animal," Miller said, stepping closer. "He is controlled," Sophia replied. And then it happened. The shot cracked the air, louder than anything Sophia had ever heard. Max yelped once, a sound she'd never heard from him before, and collapsed. Blood spilled fast onto the sidewalk. Sophia dropped beside him, hands shaking, pressing against the wound as if her touch alone could hold life in place. Her voice broke as she cried his name. "Please, Max, stay with me." But his breathing slowed, his body stilled, and the light faded from his eyes. One officer muttered that the dog was aggressive. The other holstered his weapon like nothing had happened. Across the street, Mrs. Whitman stood frozen on her porch, phone in hand, already calling emergency services. Sophia cradled Max's head, too broken to cry, too stunned to scream. Her world had just cracked wide open, and no one around her seemed to notice the sound. Sophia had not always been quiet. Before grief wrapped itself around her small shoulders, she had been a curious, spirited girl who filled notebooks with stars and asked questions faster than her mother could answer. But cancer doesn't care about childhood. When Eleanor Hayes passed away 2 years ago, something inside Sophia went with her. The bright energy dimmed. The questions stopped. The notebooks gathered dust. Michael, her father, returned from his deployment weeks after the funeral, a soldier trained to face death but not to comfort a grieving daughter. He did his best, but some silences are too big for even the strongest to fill. Michael bought the house in Oak Ridge because Eleanor had dreamed of it. A colonial with a wide porch and neatly trimmed hedges, it sat among homes that looked nearly identical in a neighborhood that seemed peaceful from the outside. The people were polite but distant. Sophia quickly learned that her presence, her skin, her silence, her dog, didn't blend in easily. Still, the move was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to honor Eleanor's memory. But memories don't carry well in cardboard boxes. Max had arrived 3 days after the funeral, not from a pet store or adoption event, but through military contacts, Michael's way of helping his daughter in a language he understood. Max was a retired service dog, trained in 4 languages, disciplined, intelligent, and quiet. From the moment he entered their home, something shifted in Sophia. She didn't speak to him at first, but she didn't need to. That night she fell asleep with her hand resting on his back, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't wake from nightmares. In the months that followed, Max became more than a companion. He was therapy when words failed. He stood at the foot of her bed every night. He waited outside the bathroom door. He walked at her side through streets that didn't always feel welcoming. He didn't just protect her, he grounded her. When her father was deployed, again Max filled the space he left behind. Not perfectly, but enough. Aunt Jasmine moved in during those absences. Fierce, brilliant, and often buried in legal files, she still made time for Sophia. She wasn't gentle, but she was steady. She showed up. And when Sophia couldn't speak about her pain, Jasmine made sure she was at least surrounded by people who understood it. On that September afternoon, Sophia had felt okay. Not happy, but stable. She wore her NASA t-shirt, the one her father gave her after his trip to Houston. She checked Max's collar, grabbed her notepad just in case she saw something interesting in the sky, and stepped out the door. Jasmine reminded her to stay close, and Sophia nodded. Outside, the street glowed under soft sunlight, the same street she had walked every day since moving here, the same street she thought she understood. She didn't know it yet, but by the time she returned, if she returned at all, nothing would feel familiar again. The police cruiser slowed beside the curb, its idle presence unsettling, like a shadow that refused to pass. Sophia noticed it right away. Her father had trained her to trust her instincts, and something about the way the car crawled, then circled back made her grip Max's leash a little tighter. Not in fear, but in caution. Max, ever watchful, walked by her side with silent obedience. When the cruiser returned and stopped this time, two doors opened. Officer Calloway emerged first, heavy-set and slow-moving, with an expression that held no warmth. Miller, younger and lean, followed close behind, scanning the sidewalk like he was looking for something to control. Sophia didn't stop walking, but her feet moved slower now. The officers closed the distance. Calloway's voice was casual on the surface, asking if she lived nearby. Sophia responded clearly, respectfully, just like her father had taught her. She told him she lived on Riverside Drive with her aunt. No mention of deployment, no unnecessary details. Miller stared at Max, his gaze sharpening. He asked if she could control the dog. Sophia said yes. Max was trained, calm, and wouldn't cause any trouble. She kept her voice steady, though her stomach was beginning to twist. Calloway claimed they were investigating reports of suspicious activity. Sophia shook her head. She hadn't seen anyone unusual. Then came the question about her father. Michael Hayes, she answered, adding softly, Army, Special Forces. She didn't expect gratitude, just distance. But the officers remained unchanged. Calloway asked for her ID. Sophia told him she didn't carry one. She was 12. Miller chuckled under his breath, muttering, convenient, with a smirk. That was when Max moved. Not a lunge, not aggression, just one careful step forward, placing himself between her and the officers like he always did when she was uncertain. Sophia adjusted her grip slightly, not out of panic, but to stay connected to something real. Miller's expression changed. His fingers drifted toward his holster. His voice lost its pretense. Control your animal, he snapped. Sophia replied with a firmer tone, saying Max was controlled and only responding to their behavior. She didn't get to finish her sentence. The shot came without warning. It exploded into the air and shattered everything. Sophia screamed as Max fell beside her, his body slamming against the pavement. Blood spread rapidly across the concrete, a thick, terrifying red. Sophia dropped to her knees, both hands pressing down on the wound, trying to stop what she already knew couldn't be stopped. Her voice broke as she pleaded with him, calling his name over and over, whispering anything she could think of to keep him present. But Max's breathing slowed. His eyes, once full of awareness, met hers one last time. His tail moved slightly, then stilled, and then he was gone. Calloway stood still, unmoved. The dog was aggressive, he said, as if reading from a script. Miller offered nothing, calmly reholstering his weapon like this was just procedure. Across the street, Mrs. Whitman had stepped onto her porch, frozen in shock, her trembling fingers dialing for help. But Sophia didn't see her. She couldn't hear anything now. Not the officers, not the sirens in the distance, just the silence where Max used to be. Sophia didn't remember how long she sat on the sidewalk after Max died. Time seemed to stretch and collapse around her, meaningless and cruel. Her knees had gone numb, her hands stained dark with blood that had already started to dry. She kept one hand on Max's chest long after his heart stopped, as if somehow she could still protect him the way he had always protected her. The voices around her blurred, officers talking into radios, neighbors murmuring from porches, sirens approaching slowly like the world hadn't quite decided whether this moment was an emergency. When someone finally tried to pull her away, she didn't move. Her body resisted, locked into place by something deeper than fear. It wasn't until a soft voice said her name, once, then again, that she blinked and turned her head. Mrs. Whitman, the elderly woman who lived across the street, was kneeling beside her eyes filled with tears and fury. Her hands trembled as she touched Sophia's shoulder, not trying to force her, just trying to reach her. "Sweetheart, come on, let's get you inside. Let's get you warm." But Sophia didn't move. Her voice was barely audible when it came out. "He wasn't supposed to die." Mrs. Whitman didn't respond. She didn't offer any false comfort. She simply sat with her, waiting. The paramedics arrived minutes later, too late for Max and too unsure of what they were walking into. An officer, one not involved in the shooting, gently helped Sophia to her feet. Her legs shook beneath her, but she stayed upright. She didn't cry. Her eyes were dry now, wide and hollow, the kind of stare that made people stop asking questions. She was taken to the station for a statement, but she didn't give one. She said nothing during the drive, nothing during processing. No answers, no questions. Just silence. Her blood-streaked hands left smudges on the vinyl seats. Back at the house, Jasmine was already waiting, pacing the front steps in bare feet, phone in one hand, keys in the other. When the cruiser pulled up, she ran toward it, fury on her face, panic rising in her voice. "Where is she? What happened? What did they do to her?" The officer barely had time to respond before Jasmine had opened the back door and pulled Sophia into her arms. The child didn't collapse. She didn't cry into her aunt's shoulder. She just stood there, rigid and exhausted. "They shot him," she whispered. "They killed Max." That night the house was silent. Jasmine called Michael overseas, and the line was filled with long pauses, clipped sentences, and disbelief that only hardened into something colder with every minute. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He just listened until Jasmine was done, then told her he'd be on the first flight back. No hesitation, no uncertainty. In her room, Sophia sat cross-legged on the floor beside Max's empty bed, his collar in her lap. She turned it slowly in her hands, the metal tag clicking against her fingers. When Jasmine knocked softly and asked if she wanted to talk, Sophia didn't answer. She didn't move. Her whisper came only after the door closed again. "I won't forget," she said into the quiet, "and I won't forgive them." The promise wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it settled into the room like smoke. Quiet, permanent, impossible to ignore. Michael Hayes stood on a rain-soaked tarmac half a world away when the call came through. The wind howled low through the hangar, sweeping dust across his boots as he read Jasmine's message for the third time. He didn't reply right away. He didn't react with the urgency one might expect. Instead, he stood there still as stone, the words burning in the back of his mind. They killed Max. Sophia saw it happen. His grip tightened around the sat phone until his knuckles paled, but his expression didn't shift. A fellow soldier called his name, asked if he was ready to roll out. Michael turned, handed the man his weapon, and said only, "I'm going home." No further explanation was required. Everyone in his unit had seen that look before. The moment when something personal overrides protocol. The flight back felt longer than usual, not in hours, but in wait. Michael sat in silence, his mind rewinding through memories like an old tape. The day he brought Max home. The way Sophia had curled around the dog that first night, still too numb to cry, but comforted by his presence. Max had been more than a dog. He had been a stand-in for Michael himself during every mission, a promise that someone strong was there to protect what he couldn't always reach. Now that promise was broken, and someone had to answer for that. By the time Michael's boots touched the driveway of his Oak Ridge home, he had already shed the skin of the soldier on assignment. What remained was something quieter, darker, more calculating. He didn't storm through the front door. He didn't yell or rage. He entered the house with the same control he had used to breach hostile buildings. Every movement was deliberate. Jasmine met him at the threshold. Her eyes were red from sleepless hours, her voice tight with unsaid emotion. She's in her room. She hasn't spoken much, barely eats, won't sleep without that collar in her hands. Michael nodded once, said nothing, and walked past her. The hallway felt longer than he remembered. Each step echoed. When he opened Sophia's door, she didn't look up. She sat on the floor, her back to the wall, Max's collar looped through her fingers like a charm. Her hair was unbrushed, her knees pulled to her chest. Michael knelt down beside her slowly, lowering himself without a word. For a moment, they sat in silence. Then Sophia spoke, her voice barely more than breath. I tried to stop the bleeding. I did everything I could. He reached out, not to take the collar, but to rest a hand on her arm. It was the gentlest touch he had offered since Eleanor died. You did more than anyone could have asked, he said, steady and soft, and now it's my turn. Sophia didn't ask what that meant. She didn't need to. Her father's face held no rage, but the stillness in his eyes was louder than any fury. It was the look of a man who had waited long enough. That night, after Sophia finally fell asleep, exhausted and wrapped in the hoodie that still smelled faintly of Max, Michael sat at the dining room table, turning over details in his mind like puzzle pieces. He didn't make calls. He didn't announce intentions. But in his silence, a familiar version of himself returned. The version that didn't rely on systems, the one trained to work alone. Michael spent the next morning doing what came naturally to him, observing, listening, preparing. He didn't reach for lawyers or public outrage. He didn't post anything online or demand press conferences. That wasn't how he operated. Instead, he moved through the house with silent precision, checking the locks on the doors, studying the angles from the windows, reviewing the external cameras he'd installed but rarely needed. His mind was already working through possibilities. If this had been just ignorance, or if it was something more pointed. He didn't yet know which it was, but experience had taught him that threats often wore uniforms and carried hollow justifications. He intended to find out which kind of threat had taken Max. Sophia remained quiet. She spoke only when necessary, and even then in clipped syllables. She moved through the house like a shadow, always within a few steps of Max's collar or his folded blanket. She didn't ask questions. She didn't complain. But Michael saw it, the way her hands trembled sometimes, the way she jumped at sudden noises. Trauma had made itself a guest again, and this time it had left claw marks. He knew better than to force conversation. He let her sit near him, let her sleep on the couch if she couldn't stay in her room, let her find comfort wherever it showed up. Healing wasn't about noise. Sometimes it was about knowing someone strong was still standing beside you without demanding anything in return. Jasmine, always sharp with words and fire, had already started pulling public records. She found the officers' names quickly, Calloway and Miller. Calloway had been with the department for over a decade. Miller was new, transferred in less than 8 months ago from a rural precinct with no disciplinary history, but a disturbing pattern of complaints, none of which had ever advanced. The more Jasmine dug, the more patterns emerged. Stops made without cause, reports that read like fiction, body cameras conveniently disabled. Michael listened as she recited the facts, but his focus was elsewhere. He didn't just want paperwork. He wanted patterns. He wanted routines. He walked the neighborhood the next day, the same route Sophia had taken, tracing each step as if searching for something invisible. Neighbors watched him from their windows. Some offered small nods of sympathy. Others turned away. He wasn't surprised. Oak Ridge had always worn its politeness like a mask. Behind it were assumptions, expectations, and a quiet discomfort with anything that didn't fit a narrow definition of normal. A 12-year-old girl with a military service dog had never quite blended in. That wasn't news to him, but now the mask had slipped. That evening, he sat with Sophia on the back porch. The air was cooler now, and she wrapped herself in a sweater far too big for her. She didn't speak, just leaned against the wooden railing and looked up at the sky. After several minutes, she finally said, "I don't feel safe anymore." Her voice cracked on the word safe. Michael didn't respond immediately. He took a breath, steady and low. Then he turned to her and said, "That's going to change." She looked at him, not with expectation, but with trust. A quiet kind of trust. The kind children reserve for the one person who never breaks a promise. He didn't say how. He didn't explain what he would do next. But in that moment, Sophia knew something had shifted. Her father wasn't just home. He was activated. Michael started his surveillance quietly, without drawing attention to himself or alerting anyone in the neighborhood. It began with the installation of two new discrete cameras, one at the edge of the mailbox, angled to capture the street view, and another embedded just inside the porch light. He reviewed the feeds from his home security system, checking timestamps, comparing vehicle movements, cataloging every car that had passed the house within the last 72 hours. Nothing seemed abnormal, but he wasn't looking for obvious signs. He was looking for rhythm, movement, behavior, anything that broke pattern. It was second nature to him. He had spent years mapping enemy territory by watching long enough to understand what wasn't supposed to be there. This wasn't a battlefield, not in the traditional sense, but the tactics applied all the same. He adjusted his daily routine to overlap with the school run and local patrols. Whenever a cruiser passed near the house, he took note of the officers inside. He logged badge numbers. He documented timing. He wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. He was gathering data. The truth, he believed, didn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it revealed itself when you simply watched long enough without blinking. The footage showed that Miller had passed the street twice more since the shooting, both times slowing near the end of the block, but never stopping. It was subtle, almost unremarkable. But to Michael, it wasn't nothing. It was intention disguised as coincidence. Sophia noticed the shifts, even if she didn't understand all of them. Her father's questions became more focused. What time did you usually leave for walks? Did Max ever react to anyone before that day? She answered what she could, though her memory of that afternoon remained foggy in places. Some details she had blocked out entirely, others returned in pieces. Calloway's posture, Miller's tone, the way Max had tensed but not growled. She remembered how her heart had raced before anything even happened, like her body had known what her mind hadn't caught up to yet. Jasmine, meanwhile, continued working through official channels. She filed early complaints, submitted preliminary legal notices, and contacted a handful of trusted journalists who owed her favors. But even she admitted the story wouldn't hold unless there was something solid behind it. In Oak Ridge, image mattered more than truth, and the image of two officers claiming a dangerous animal posed a threat might be enough for the town to look away, unless they had something better. Evidence, witnesses, patterns that couldn't be explained away with paperwork and press releases. That's when Michael reviewed the footage again, frame by frame, and noticed something strange. On the day of the shooting, across the street, 2 houses down from Mrs. Whitman, a third figure had been standing behind the blinds. A silhouette, still, watching. Whoever it was had been there the entire time, never stepping out, never calling for help, just observing. He didn't know who lived in that house, but now it was on his list. He noted the time. He marked the footage, and he added the address to the file he had already started building. A quiet collection of truth, angles, patterns, and names. That night, Michael didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with a notebook in front of him, drawing a crude map of the neighborhood. His handwriting was small and tight, his annotations precise. He labeled the houses, marked the cameras, tracked the officer sightings. Sophia passed by once on her way to the bathroom and saw him there, hunched over blue ink and coffee. She didn't ask what he was doing. She already knew. Her father wasn't just watching, he was preparing. It was Jasmine who first received the call, a block number late in the evening, just as she was closing her laptop for the night. The voice on the other end was hesitant, quiet, and clearly watching their words. He introduced himself as Officer Parker, a patrol officer from the same department as Calloway and Miller. Jasmine didn't speak at first. She let him talk, her silence giving him room to find the edge of his courage. He said he couldn't stay quiet anymore. He said what happened to Sophia and Max wasn't an accident, and everyone inside the station knew it. He said there were whispers not just about that day, but about a pattern, about cover-ups, false reports, and unspoken rules about who to stop and when to escalate. Jasmine listened closely, her mind filing every sentence into mental folders. She didn't interrupt, though her heart beat faster with every detail. Officer Parker wasn't ready to go public, not yet, but he was willing to meet, privately, carefully. She agreed and told him to come alone. He did. The next afternoon, Parker arrived at Jasmine's office, wearing civilian clothes and a nervous expression. He looked over his shoulder 3 times before entering the building. Jasmine led him to the back conference room and closed the door. He didn't waste time. He slid a small flash drive across the table and said it contained internal memos and redacted incident reports that never made it into the public files. "Miller's trigger happy," Parker said, his voice low. "There have been complaints, not just from black families, but they all get filtered or filed under procedural compliance. No footage, no public pressure. Nothing ever sticks. The department protects its own." Jasmine asked about Calloway. Parker nodded grimly. "He's worse. Knows how to skirt the system. He mentors rookies like Miller. Teaches them what they can get away with." Parker said the department culture had changed in the last few years. Not openly hostile, but quietly selective. Certain neighborhoods got more attention. Certain people got more scrutiny. It was subtle, but effective. He said Sophia's name had already been flagged in a discussion about sensitive cases, though he didn't know who made the entry. When Jasmine asked why he was doing this now, Parker looked down at his hands and said, "Because that girl was just walking her dog, and she's going to remember his blood for the rest of her life. I can't carry that with silence." Later that evening, Jasmine shared the meeting with Michael. He didn't say much, just nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the wall like he was listening to something deeper than words. He took the flash drive and began reviewing the files in silence. Each line confirmed what he had already started to suspect. This wasn't a one-time incident. It was a pattern, a culture, a system that allowed violence and hid behind red tape. But now a crack had formed. One of their own had broken ranks, and that was all Michael needed. He spent the rest of the night sorting through the evidence, highlighting connections, drawing lines between names and dates. It was no longer just about Max. It was about something much larger, something that had slipped through the cracks for too long. And if the system wouldn't hold its own accountable, then he would. Not with rage, with strategy. Officer Parker hadn't expected to feel the shift so quickly after stepping outside the department's circle of silence, but it came like clockwork. On the second night after his meeting with Jasmine, he noticed the same black sedan parked down the street from his apartment building. It didn't have markings and no one ever got out, but it sat there with its headlights off, engine idle, and a presence that felt intentional. He wasn't the paranoid type, but years in uniform had taught him how to notice patterns, especially the kind that didn't announce themselves. On the third night, it was back again. He waited by the window and watched as someone in the driver's seat raised a phone, aimed it briefly in his direction, and then drove away without incident. No interaction, no confrontation, just presence, enough to make a point. At the station, Parker kept his head down. He attended roll call, responded when addressed, and said nothing about what he'd done. Calloway wasn't in the building that day, but Miller was, laughing a little too loudly in the break room, moving a little too confidently through the halls. Parker avoided eye contact, pretending to be immersed in reports. But when he returned to the locker room mid-shift, he found a folded note tucked into the side pocket of his gym bag. It wasn't handwritten. It was typed in block letters. "Remember who signs your paycheck." No name, no date, no explanation. He tore it into strips and flushed it without a word. The thought of backing out crept in by the time he pulled into his driveway that night. He sat in the car with the engine running, staring at the dashboard, weighing the risk. He hadn't signed anything. He hadn't admitted anything formally. He could still pretend the meeting never happened. He could tell Jasmine that she misunderstood his intention. But as he stepped out and walked toward his front door, he passed the community board, where someone had pinned a printed photo of Sophia and Max, taken from an online vigil post. Someone had written across the bottom in blue ink, "She was just walking her dog." That image lingered in his mind longer than the sedan or the note. He remembered the look on Sophia's face in the photo still, lost, blood-stained, barely holding it together. And he remembered what it felt like to watch from the inside, while truth was rewritten by convenience. He had seen it happen before, sometimes small things, other times like this, irreversible. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at his phone. His thumb hovered over Jasmine's contact. He didn't draft anything long, just a short message. Still in. They're watching me now too. Stay sharp. He paused for a moment, then hit send. Immediately after, he cleared the thread and powered off the phone. He didn't have a plan for what came next. There were no backup files or safety nets. But silence had stopped being an option. Whatever happened, he had crossed that point the moment he handed over the flash drive. He told himself it wasn't about being brave. It was about being unable to look the other way anymore. Jasmine's office had never felt like a war room before. But over the last 48 hours, the energy had shifted. Papers were spread across the table. Color-coded tabs marked timelines and legal precedents. And her inbox filled faster than she could reply. She had always been relentless in her practice. But this was personal. This wasn't just about civil rights theory or legal strategy. This was about Sophia, about blood on concrete, about a system so tightly wound in its own protection that even a child's trauma had to fight for recognition. The flash drive Parker had delivered sat beside her laptop, its contents already reviewed, cataloged, and backed up to 3 different locations. She wasn't about to let evidence this rare disappear into technical failure or accidental deletion. Michael sat across from her, silent, arms folded, eyes locked on the flow of information. He didn't interrupt. He didn't pace. He just watched, absorbing every name, every incident report, every redacted paragraph that hinted at a wider rot within the department. The deeper Jasmine went, the more familiar names surfaced. Cases that had slipped through the cracks, all following the same pattern. Minorities, use of force, missing footage, internal reviews that closed quickly. There were too many to be coincidence. What shocked her most was how much of it had been hidden in plain sight. Public records that told one version, while internal notes whispered a different story entirely. She began filing motions within 24 hours, carefully worded, legally airtight, just enough to signal that something was coming without revealing the full weight behind it. She filed a preliminary civil rights violation notice with the city. She requested access to the department's internal investigation policies. She submitted a public call for witnesses to the shooting, citing the presence of neighbors and bystanders. The goal wasn't immediate action. It was to plant flags, markers that would make it harder for the city to quietly dismiss what had happened. Once the wheels started turning, she could apply pressure from every angle. At home, Sophia remained mostly withdrawn, but Michael could feel the slow shift. She was asking small questions now. Where was Max's blanket? Could she keep his tag on her backpack? Would it be okay if she wrote down what she remembered, even if it didn't all make sense? Michael encouraged her gently, never pushing, always present. He knew healing wouldn't follow a straight line. It came in fragments, in moments where safety was restored one quiet piece at a time. That evening, Jasmine returned from a meeting with a city liaison and laid a folder on the table. Inside was a printed complaint that had been buried in departmental archives, a past incident involving Miller during his time in another precinct. It had been closed without action, but the description mirrored Sophia's case almost exactly. A teenager, a large dog, no video footage, claim of perceived threat, the animal shot. Jasmine looked at Michael and said, "They've done this before, and the system helped them erase it." Michael didn't respond immediately. He reached for the folder and began reading. Every word he took in with deliberate focus. When he finally looked up, his voice was calm. "Then we don't just build a case. We build a wall so high they can't climb over it." That night, the legal battle began. Not in court, but in documents, dates, files, and names. Jasmine would handle the system. Michael would handle everything outside it. Between the two of them, the walls protecting men like Miller and Calloway had started to crack. The only question left was how far the collapse would reach. The retaliation came quietly, without warning, and without any obvious fingerprints. It began with a knock at the door from a pair of child services representatives holding a thin manila folder and overly polite expressions. Jasmine answered while Michael stood just out of sight, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The lead agent introduced herself and explained they were following up on an anonymous report. The nature of the report, she claimed, involved concerns about Sophia's emotional stability and her current living environment. She said someone had reported troubling signs, unexplained outbursts, signs of possible neglect, and an unsafe household dynamic. Jasmine asked for the specific allegations. The woman hesitated, then admitted the complaint had come through a third-party hotline with no attached name. A routine welfare check, she insisted, just to be thorough. Michael stepped into the doorway, saying nothing. He didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the tone. The agent's smiles became thinner. Their questions turned softer, their phrasing more cautious. They asked to speak with Sophia. Jasmine refused. She knew the law and quoted it word for word. No entry without a warrant. No interviews without counsel. The agents left soon after, promising follow-up, but everyone in the house knew exactly what it was. A message. A threat wearing the face of procedure. Later that evening, Sophia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the folder Jasmine had dropped on the kitchen table. "Are they trying to take me away?" she asked. Michael crouched beside her and shook his head. "No one's taking you. You're safe here." She nodded, but he could see the question still lingered behind her eyes. It wasn't about custody, it was about safety, stability, the idea that people who had done nothing wrong could still be targeted, still be punished, simply for surviving. Jasmine worked late into the night drafting a preemptive legal response. She knew how fast these kinds of accusations could spiral, especially when the wrong people wanted them to. She prepared documentation, medical records, therapy notes, school attendance, and eyewitness affidavits, all ready to counter any fabricated claims. Michael reviewed the names on the report headers and noted a familiar signature at the bottom of the intake form. An administrative liaison linked to Calloway's precinct. He didn't say anything at first, just circled the name with a red pen and set it aside. The next morning, another cruiser parked down the block, lingering just long enough to be noticed. It didn't approach. No one stepped out. But the message was the same. You're being watched. Michael stood on the front lawn with a coffee in his hand and stared directly at the vehicle until it pulled away. He wasn't intimidated. He was collecting patterns. At breakfast, Sophia ate in silence. She pushed her cereal around the bowl without interest, her face distant. Then, without lifting her eyes, she asked, "Why are they doing this?" Jasmine looked at her, choosing her words carefully. "Because they think fear will make us stop, but we won't." Michael added nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was an anchor now, a reminder that strength didn't always roar. That afternoon, Jasmine filed a formal complaint against the department's misuse of child welfare protocols. She attached supporting documents, case history, and civil rights precedents. It wouldn't stop them, not right away. But it would raise the cost of continuing. And Michael, for his part, wasn't waiting for courtrooms to do what he already knew how to handle. They had made the first move. Now he was preparing for the next one. Not with emotion, with precision. Sophia had returned to school only because Jasmine insisted it was important to keep things feeling normal, even when nothing about her life felt that way. The halls were quiet, the teachers polite but cautious, their glances hovering just a moment too long. Her classmates didn't ask questions. A few offered timid hellos. Most kept their distance, unsure of what to say to the girl whose name had been whispered in every corner of the building since the incident. Max's death wasn't just a story. It had become a ghost that followed her between classrooms. Sophia didn't speak unless prompted. She kept her hoodie on, kept her eyes low, and kept the small tag from Max's collar in her front pocket, rubbing it between her fingers during moments of silence. It was during lunch, halfway through the day, that the air shifted. She saw the cruiser through the cafeteria window before anyone else did, parked just outside the main office, its lights off, engine idling. A second one pulled in moments later. She felt it before she understood it. Not a full panic, but a rising pressure in her chest that made it hard to breathe. A teacher was called to the office. Then the principal left the cafeteria. Something was happening. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her backpack and pulled out the small digital recorder her therapist had given her months ago. A coping tool meant to help her process emotions through voice journaling. Today, it would serve a different purpose. She slipped the recorder into her pocket and quietly made her way out of the cafeteria, ducking into the empty library. There, behind a row of tall bookshelves, she crouched low, pressed record, and waited. The walls were thin enough that she could hear the muffled conversation spilling in from the hallway. She heard Officer Miller's voice first, stern, impatient. Then the school counselor's voice trying to de-escalate, and finally the principal, hesitant and unsure, asking what exactly this visit was about. Miller's reply was clipped. Wellness follow-up. Just routine. We're just concerned she may not be stable. Sophia's hands tightened around the recorder. She knew what this was. Another scare tactic. Another attempt to paint her as unstable. To rattle her foundation until it cracked. She pressed the recorder closer, hoping it caught everything. Then she heard something that froze her in place. If Hayes keeps pushing, she's going to end up in foster care. We're just making sure she knows what's at stake. The voice was quiet but clear. It wasn't a direct threat. It was worse. It was strategy. When the voices faded and the hallway emptied, Sophia waited another full minute before standing. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her, but she made her way to the nurse's office, said she felt lightheaded, and asked to go home. Jasmine arrived 20 minutes later, a storm barely contained behind her eyes. Sophia said nothing until they were in the car. Then, without a word, she reached into her pocket and handed Jasmine the recorder. Jasmine played the audio in silence. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter with every passing second. Michael listened to it that evening. He didn't speak when it ended. He simply looked at Sophia, then placed a hand on her shoulder. For the first time since Max died, there was something different in her eyes. Not just fear, not just pain. There was defiance. Quiet, earned, and steady. She had acted on her own terms, and in doing so, she had joined the fight. Michael had set traps before, in cities far from home, under conditions where one wrong move could collapse everything. But this time, the operation was personal. He didn't need explosives or stealth entries. He needed clarity, documentation, and undeniable evidence. The recording Sophia captured had changed everything. It confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't about protocol. It was about control. And now they had spoken too freely, too close to a school, too unaware of who might be listening. Michael decided it was time to let them speak again, but this time, on his terms. He spent the next 2 days modifying the home's existing security system. He installed high-definition mics behind the hallway light fixtures, rewired the doorbell camera for a wider angle, and placed a discreet motion-activated recorder beneath the front console table. Every entry point in the house became part of a silent net. Then he waited. Not long. On the third day, around mid-afternoon, a knock came at the front door. Jasmine was at the courthouse. Sophia was at school. Michael had made sure of that. He opened the door slowly, his face unreadable, and found Officer Calloway standing alone on the porch. Calloway offered a half smile, the kind that didn't reach the eyes. He didn't ask to come in. He just stepped forward like he owned the space. Michael didn't move. The two men stood eye to eye. Calloway's voice was low and composed as he began to speak. He said he was there unofficially, that there were concerns about the direction things were headed. He said there were ways to handle misunderstandings before they became public spectacle. Michael said nothing. He let Calloway keep talking. He nodded slowly, asked short questions to keep the man going. All of it was being recorded. Every veiled threat, every reference to people who knew how to make things disappear, every mention of how the system has ways of protecting its own. The conversation lasted 17 minutes. By the end of it, Calloway had stopped pretending. His words were still wrapped in civility, but the message was clear. If Michael didn't back down, if Jasmine kept filing, if Sophia's recording made its way into public hands, things would get harder, for all of them. Then just before turning to leave, Calloway offered a final line. Soft, casual, but dangerous. You've got a good kid. Shame if this town decided she didn't belong here anymore. Michael didn't react. He simply closed the door behind the man and walked into the living room. He sat down, copied the footage to a secure drive, and labeled the file with a single word: leverage. Later that night, he played the recording for Jasmine. Her expression shifted from disbelief to fury in a matter of seconds. "He just admitted everything," she said, standing from her chair. Michael nodded. "And we're not done." When Sophia returned from school, she noticed the shift in energy. Her father moved differently, calm, focused, unflinching. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was executing a plan. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. He told her only what mattered. "They came to our door. Now the truth is coming to theirs." She didn't smile, but she nodded. The mistake wasn't loud. She understood. The mistake wasn't loud. It wasn't even impulsive. It came from Officer Miller's growing comfort with intimidation, his belief that presence alone would keep everyone on edge. Over the weeks that followed the shooting, he circled their street more often, adjusted his patrol routes to brush closer to Sophia's school, and slowed down near the house just enough to be noticed, but never challenged. He operated under the assumption that the family was still reacting, still too broken or scattered to fight back. What he didn't know was that Michael had already tracked every visit, compared every timestamp, and matched his movements against precinct logs. The visits didn't line up with official duty. They weren't random. And by the time Miller stepped foot on their property, everything was ready. It happened late in the afternoon, a gray sky overhead, and a breeze that barely moved the trees. Jasmine was working through legal documentation at the kitchen table. Sophia had just come home from school and dropped her bag by the door. Michael, watching the perimeter feed from the garage, saw Miller approaching long before the knock came. He didn't call Jasmine. He didn't ask Sophia to hide. He opened the front door calmly and stood in the frame as Miller straightened his posture. The officer said he was following up on an earlier report, that he needed to check in on Sophia's emotional condition. His voice tried to sound official, but there was a current of irritation beneath it, a rehearsed explanation spoken too many times before. Michael didn't respond. He let him speak. He let the hidden microphones record every syllable. Without asking for permission, Miller stepped inside. He crossed the entryway as if the home were part of his jurisdiction, not a private sanctuary he had no right to invade. Jasmine appeared instantly, stepping between him and the hallway, her tone clipped and legal. She asked for a warrant. He didn't have one. She asked if he intended to file a formal report. He deflected. As he pressed on, raising his voice under the pretense of procedure, Sophia stepped from behind the hallway door. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She held the small voice recorder in her palm, already powered on, already capturing every word. She told him to leave. Her voice was quiet but steady. She reminded him that he was being recorded. Again. The tension shifted. Miller paused, his posture faltering as he looked from Sophia to Michael, then to Jasmine's phone already in her hand. He backed up one step, then two. The control he thought he had over the room began to slip, not because anyone shouted or pushed him out, but because no one looked afraid anymore. As he turned toward the door, he muttered something under his breath, a slur, angry and low, meant to wound on his way out. Michael didn't react. He opened the door wide and waited until Miller stepped through it. Then he closed it slowly and walked back into the house. That night, Michael copied the footage and shared it with Jasmine. She listened to it twice before packaging it into a legal briefing for the Internal Affairs Department. The slur alone was enough to escalate everything. No longer was it just about intimidation or misconduct. It was now proof of motive, bias, and hostility, all spoken freely in the victim's home. Sophia said little, but that evening she sat beside her father and leaned her head gently against his shoulder. The silence between them didn't carry fear anymore. It carried something else. Recovery that didn't need words. The recording changed everything. Jasmine wasted no time. By morning, she had submitted a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office, backed with a full audio clip of Officer Miller's visit, including his use of a racial slur and unlawful entry into a private residence. She followed that with a civil rights violation claim supported by Sophia's earlier school recording, linking it all to a growing pattern of intimidation and abuse of power. The file wasn't just detailed, it was surgical. She didn't just tell a story, she proved it, name by name, incident by incident, every line documented with time codes, transcripts, and corroborating evidence. Within 24 hours, the complaint made its way up the ladder. Within 48, the federal response began to take shape. Michael kept a careful eye on the house as the tension grew. He wasn't worried about reporters or paperwork. He was watching for something quieter, an act of desperation from men who now knew their masks had slipped. He maintained his security systems, expanded the cloud backup storage, and began keeping a firearm within reach at all times, though always locked when Sophia was home. He didn't want violence, but he wasn't naive. Exposure didn't always end corruption. Sometimes it provoked it. By the end of the week, unmarked federal vehicles arrived in Oak Ridge. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't wear jackets with initials. But Jasmine knew the signs. They moved with intent, speaking only to officials, reviewing files without discussion. Michael watched them too, though from a distance. He noted who they spoke with. He tracked how long they remained inside precinct buildings. He saw the shift in the neighborhood, how officers who once drove past their homes slowed down even more now, but didn't stop. There was no more false confidence in their posture. Now there was uncertainty. Captain Richardson, who had remained noticeably silent during the early weeks, requested a meeting with Jasmine through official channels. They met at a neutral office space in the city. The conversation was cautious but direct. Richardson acknowledged the footage, admitted the internal investigation would now be superseded by the Department of Justice, and quietly expressed something that surprised Jasmine: regret. Not over being caught, but for not acting sooner. She claimed she had been aware of tensions building within her department, but had underestimated the scope. Whether that was truth or damage control, Jasmine couldn't be sure. But she logged every word nonetheless. Meanwhile, Sophia remained protected and informed. Michael told her only what she needed to know. She asked if the men who killed Max would be arrested. He didn't lie. He told her it was possible, but that justice didn't always move quickly. She asked if what she recorded would help other kids like her. He told her it already had. She didn't cry. She didn't smile either. But that night, she left Max's collar on the dining table instead of sleeping with it pressed to her chest. It wasn't surrender. It was a signal, her way of letting go just enough to breathe. As federal oversight increased, the department began shifting defensively. Miller was placed on temporary leave. Calloway stopped reporting in entirely. Rumors circulated of resignations being negotiated quietly to avoid public spectacle. But Michael wasn't interested in rumors. He only believed in outcomes. He continued building his files, archiving everything, preparing for the next step. The federal storm had arrived, but in Michael's mind, it wasn't the beginning of justice. It was simply the signal that the real fight had finally reached the people who couldn't ignore it anymore. The report came quietly, buried in a PDF attached to an email forwarded from a federal investigator. Jasmine opened it late at night, long after Sophia had gone to bed, and Michael had retired to the living room to review footage. The document was marked internal, not for public release, and heavily redacted in places, but the name stood out clearly in the center of the page: Robert Calloway. A history she hadn't known, a dishonorable discharge, 2 misconduct citations, 1 sealed incident connected to a former Special Forces unit stationed overseas. Jasmine's heart sank as she read the summary, realizing this wasn't just about bias or arrogance. This was something much deeper, something personal. When she handed the report to Michael the next morning, she didn't speak. She let him read it in full, watching his face for a reaction that didn't come. His eyes moved steadily across the page, one line at a time, until they landed on the details she had circled. Calloway had once served under Michael's command. Years ago. Different theater, different mission, same man. When Michael finally looked up, his voice was flat. I had him removed. He left in disgrace. I never thought I'd see his name again. He stood slowly and walked to the window, the file still in his hand, his posture heavy with something Jasmine hadn't seen in him before. Not anger, not fear, but betrayal. Michael explained everything in a quiet, even tone. Calloway had been part of a joint operation overseas, one that involved sensitive engagements and strict protocol. He had disobeyed a direct order, endangering civilians. Michael had reported him. The military had processed the incident quietly, moved Calloway stateside, and eventually out of uniform. Somehow, years later, he had slipped into civilian law enforcement, just far enough from that disgrace to start over, just close enough to retain the mindset he'd never left behind. Michael hadn't recognized him right away. It had been too long, but now with the confirmation staring back at him, the shooting no longer felt random. It felt deliberate. Sophia listened from the hallway, unseen. She didn't interrupt, but her presence wasn't hidden for long. When Michael turned from the window, he saw her standing there. She didn't ask questions. She simply said, "He knew who you were." Michael nodded. "Yes." Her face tightened. Then he knew what Max meant. Michael didn't answer. He didn't need to. That evening, Jasmine drafted a revised legal summary. She added the connection between Michael and Calloway, the prior military history, and the possible motive for a targeted confrontation. With federal oversight in place, this new layer could shift the tone of the entire investigation. No longer just misconduct. Now it hinted at retaliation, personal vendetta, abuse of authority rooted in unresolved history. She knew the weight of that kind of story. It didn't just land in the courts. It moved people, and that movement brought change. Michael sat alone in the garage that night, surrounded by screens, still reviewing old mission files and comparing them to the recent footage. Not because he doubted what he had read, but because something deeper had settled inside him. The man who had once risked his career to report Calloway now found himself fighting him again, not in the field, but in his own neighborhood. This time, the cost had been personal. The betrayal wasn't just professional. It had bled into his home. And now he wasn't going to let the past repeat itself. The house was quiet that evening, not the kind of quiet that comes with rest, but the kind that arrives after a heavy truth has settled in. Sophia had barely spoken since learning about her father's connection to Calloway. She wasn't upset, she wasn't confused, but she was processing, and Michael knew better than to fill that silence too quickly. He moved through the house with his usual precision, reviewing files, checking camera feeds, making notes in his worn black notebook. Sophia watched him from a distance, not speaking, but studying him in the way children do when they're trying to understand more than just words. She had always known her father was strong, but now she understood that strength didn't come from volume. It came from restraint. After dinner, they sat outside on the back porch, where the air was cool and the sounds of the neighborhood had faded into the rustle of leaves. Sophia had wrapped herself in a light blanket and sat beside her father without saying anything at first. The stars were faint behind a veil of clouds, but she looked up anyway. Max had always laid at her feet during these moments, his head resting on her shoe, content just to be near. She didn't cry. Instead, she held a small recorder in her lap, the one that had captured the moment things began to shift. She turned it slowly in her hands, not playing it, just remembering. It took a long time before she finally spoke, and when she did, her voice was steady. "Are you going to kill them?" The question hung in the air between them, not out of shock or fear, but out of sincerity. She didn't whisper it. She didn't rush it. It was clear she had thought about it long before the words came out. Michael didn't respond immediately. He didn't flinch or act surprised. He looked straight ahead, his hands folded, his jaw tight. After a long pause, he said, "No." His voice was low but certain. Sophia looked down. "But they deserve it." Michael nodded once. "Yes, they do." She didn't speak again right away. He let the silence hold between them, giving her space to continue. Finally, she said, "If you did it, I wouldn't hate you. I'd understand." Her words didn't come from bitterness. They came from loss, from the kind of clarity that only comes when justice has been delayed for too long. Michael turned toward her, meeting her eyes. "I know," he said gently, "but I didn't raise you to live in a world where we fix pain with more pain." Sophia looked back at the sky. Her voice was softer this time. "So what do we do?" Michael answered without hesitation. "We win, not with violence, with truth, with proof, with strategy. We don't bury them. We expose them." She didn't nod. She didn't argue. She just sat with that answer, turning it over like a stone in her hand. And after a moment, she leaned her head against his arm. In that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them. An understanding that revenge would never undo what had been taken, but that justice, the slow and deliberate kind, could still mean something. It wouldn't bring Max back. It wouldn't erase the fear or the scars. But it would matter. And for Sophia, that was enough, for now. The operation wasn't public. It wasn't loud. It happened with the kind of precision that signaled serious people were finally paying attention. Unmarked vehicles arrived just after dawn, dispersing across Oak Ridge in calculated silence. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, just quiet movement and firm decisions. Federal agents, coordinated with state oversight, had reviewed the compiled footage, audio recordings, and legal filings for nearly 2 weeks. The evidence was undeniable. There was no room left for excuses, no technicality strong enough to obscure what had been captured so clearly. It was time to act. Calloway was taken first, pulled from his home before breakfast. He didn't resist, but his face betrayed everything. Not surprise, not shame, just contempt. Like the process was beneath him, like justice was an inconvenience he hadn't expected to land this close. His hands were cuffed behind his back, while neighbors peeked from behind curtains. His wife stood in the doorway, unmoving, arms crossed, eyes fixed on nothing. Michael watched the footage on a secure link provided by Jasmine. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, but he felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't satisfaction, it was validation. Proof that exposure, not revenge, had power. Miller was next. His arrest took place outside a gas station on the edge of town. He had been called in for a routine meeting and intercepted en route. The moment the agents approached, his posture changed. He tried to walk away, but 2 unmarked sedans boxed him in. His protests were brief, poorly constructed. By the time he realized he was surrounded, it was over. No dramatic outburst, just cuffs, Miranda rights, and a sudden realization that his badge no longer shielded him. Michael watched that footage too, and again he didn't speak. He just took note of the time. 8:42 a.m. By mid-morning, word had spread through the Oak Ridge community. Some responded with surprise, others with silence. A few vocal residents took to social media to defend the officers, citing years of service, long records, and loyalty to the community. But the recordings circulated faster than the apologies. The things they said couldn't be denied. The footage couldn't be edited. And the child they had tried to intimidate was no longer just a victim. She had become the reason the silence had broken. At home, Sophia watched from the living room with Jasmine sitting quietly beside her. Michael stood near the window, phone in hand, ready for updates. The television showed a live feed from a local news helicopter hovering above the station. Reporters speculated. Anchors rephrased what they already knew. But it was the images that mattered most. Uniforms stripped. Cars searched. A department under review. Sophia didn't speak for most of it, but when the camera cut to a close-up of Calloway being led into the station in handcuffs, she finally exhaled. Later that afternoon, Jasmine held a press conference on the courthouse steps. She kept her remarks measured, focused on the facts, the importance of accountability, the bravery it took to speak up. She didn't mention Sophia by name, but she didn't need to. Everyone watching already knew. Her voice was steady, her presence strong. And when the questions came, she answered them with the confidence of someone who had never been afraid to fight in daylight. Back home, Michael turned off the television and sat beside his daughter. Neither of them said anything at first. Then softly, Sophia asked, "Is it over?" He looked at her and answered the only way he could. "Number, but it's beginning." The courthouse felt colder than usual, not because of the temperature, but because of the weight of what was about to unfold. People entered the building without fanfare, their footsteps soft on the polished floors, their expressions hushed with anticipation. The trial wasn't a spectacle in the way media scandals often are. It was quieter, more surgical, wrapped in legal language and exhibits marked by numbers. But beneath the formality, there was tension, a slow boil beneath the surface. In the front row sat Jasmine, composed and steady, a legal pad in her lap and years of preparation behind her eyes. Beside her, Sophia sat in a black dress, her fingers curled gently around Max's old tag, which she kept hidden in her pocket, a small memory anchored in metal. Michael had chosen not to testify. His role had been too connected, too familiar with the officers in question. The prosecution agreed it was better to keep his name in the background, to let the facts speak through recordings, witness statements, and documents. But he was there every day, sitting in the second row, shoulders squared, silent, and alert. He wasn't a presence of intimidation. He was a reminder. A father who never left the room where his child's trauma was being put on public display. The prosecution laid out the case with clarity. They played the recording from the school hallway, where Officer Miller threatened Sophia through insinuation. They followed it with the home footage, showing his unauthorized entry, the escalation, the slur. The courtroom sat in stillness as the audio played, each word echoing off the walls with quiet consequence. Faces shifted, eyes dropped. A few jurors glanced toward the defense table, but not for long. Then came the testimony from Mrs. Whitman, who had witnessed the shooting. Her voice trembled at times, but her conviction never wavered. She said plainly, "That dog was still, calm. That officer didn't hesitate. He just pulled the trigger." Calloway's attorney tried to redirect, framing the event as a misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication during a stressful encounter. He referenced the environment, the need for officer safety, the blurred lines of fast decisions. But the recordings were clear, the timeline was tight, and the patterns, documented in file after file, left little room for alternate interpretation. Miller remained impassive for most of the proceedings, staring forward, expression blank. Calloway, on the other hand, occasionally whispered to his lawyer, shook his head at certain testimonies as if disbelief alone could undo what had already been shown. Sophia didn't watch every moment. Some days she stepped out before the end. Some mornings she arrived late. But when she was present, she listened closely, eyes focused on the facts, on the people who had once tried to make her feel small. She never cried in the courtroom. She didn't need to. Her presence alone said more than any outburst ever could. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution reminded the jury that this case wasn't built on theory. It was built on truth captured in real time. It wasn't about hatred of law enforcement. It was about accountability, about the protection of children, and about the limits of unchecked power. The courtroom remained still as those final words settled into the space between everyone seated there. That evening, back home, Sophia sat on the couch with Jasmine and Michael. The television was off. The house was still. She looked at them both and whispered, "Max would have protected me again if he could." Michael placed a hand over hers. "He did, and now the world finally knows it." The idea didn't come from Michael or Jasmine. It came from Sophia, spoken so softly one afternoon that at first Jasmine thought she'd misheard. They had been driving past a small veterinary clinic on the outskirts of town, a place Sophia used to pass during her walks with Max. The car was quiet, the windows cracked just enough to let in the wind. Sophia looked out and said, "Do you think we could visit the shelter sometime?" She didn't turn her head when she said it. She kept her eyes on the fence outside the clinic, where a small sign hung with a hand-painted message that read, "Adopt Hope." Jasmine didn't answer right away. She glanced at Sophia, saw the stillness in her face, and nodded gently. "When you're ready." They didn't go the next day, or even that week. Time passed in slow, uneven days. The trial was nearing its end. The public noise was growing louder. But inside their home, things were quieter. Sophia began sleeping more soundly. The edge in her voice softened. She still carried Max's tag in her pocket, but she no longer held it every hour. And then, one Saturday morning, she came downstairs already dressed, holding the small green notebook she used for sketching. "I think I'm ready now," she said. Jasmine didn't ask what changed. She just grabbed her keys. The shelter was modest, tucked between a hardware store and a shuttered cafe. The woman at the front desk recognized Jasmine immediately, her expression shifting from curiosity to cautious warmth. She didn't bring up the case. She simply nodded and guided them through a back hallway into a row of kennels, where dogs of all sizes barked and paced and stared through the bars with hopeful eyes. Sophia walked slowly, hands clasped in front of her, pausing at each enclosure. Most of the dogs were too energetic, too loud, too eager. Then near the end of the hallway, she stopped. The dog was medium-sized with deep brown eyes and a coat the color of old oak bark. She wasn't barking. She wasn't pacing. She was just sitting, watching Sophia with quiet curiosity. Her ears twitched, but she didn't move. There was a calmness in her posture that reminded Sophia of something familiar, though not exactly the same. Jasmine watched as Sophia crouched down in front of the gate. "What's her name?" she asked the staff member nearby. "Stella," the woman said. "She's been here for a while. Doesn't warm up to most people, but she's not aggressive, just careful." They spent nearly an hour there. Sophia sat on the floor just outside the kennel, talking softly, sometimes not speaking at all. Stella didn't bark once. She moved closer, inch by inch, until her nose pressed gently against Sophia's fingers through the bars. That evening, they began the adoption paperwork. Michael didn't say much when they got home. He looked at Sophia, who held a small information packet in her hands like it was something fragile. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "She's not Max, I know that." He crouched down beside her. "She doesn't have to be." Sophia looked down at the collar still sitting on the table, the one that had belonged to Max. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she said, "I want to give her a new one, a different tag, but I think I'll keep his too." Michael nodded. "That sounds right." In the weeks that followed, Stella became part of the rhythm of their home. Quiet, observant, always near but never imposing, just like Sophia needed. Time didn't erase what happened, but it softened the sharpest edges. The trial concluded with both officers found guilty, one on charges of civil rights violations, the other for misconduct and obstruction. Sentences were handed down with language that felt careful, restrained, as if even justice had to tiptoe through a system reluctant to confront itself. But for Sophia, for Michael, and for Jasmine, the verdict wasn't the end. It was a marker, proof that what they fought for had been seen, acknowledged, and recorded. Not just in legal documents, but in the memory of a town that would never be able to claim ignorance again. Sophia never went back to the same school. Jasmine arranged a transfer, and Michael supported the choice without question. Some places couldn't be returned to, not because of fear, but because they no longer held space for healing. In her new environment, Sophia was quieter than most, but not withdrawn. She joined an astronomy club. She started sketching again, stars, planets, things her mother once dreamed of naming. She didn't talk about Max often, but she didn't avoid the topic either. When a classmate once asked if she'd ever had a dog, she answered honestly, "Yeah, he saved my life, twice." At home, Stella found her rhythm. She wasn't Max. She didn't try to be. She followed Sophia with gentle curiosity, never too far, never too close. Michael took her on walks through the same streets he once patrolled with his daughter and Max. Neighbors greeted him now with small nods, a shift in tone that acknowledged not just his presence, but what he had done. He didn't seek their approval, but he noted the difference. It wasn't acceptance, it was recognition. Jasmine returned to her full caseload, though her name now carried more weight in certain courtrooms. She had become a symbol of what persistence could look like when tied to purpose. She never claimed victory. She didn't label herself a hero. She simply continued, knowing that the next family might need the same strength, the same fight, the same refusal to be silent. On the anniversary of the shooting, the family didn't hold a public memorial. Instead, they drove out to a clearing on the edge of the state park, one of the few places where the sky opened wide enough to see the stars clearly. They brought a blanket, 2 thermoses of hot cocoa, and a telescope that Michael had assembled in the days leading up to the trip. Sophia set it up herself, her hands steady, her focus calm. She found Orion first, then Vega. Michael pointed out Mars, faint but visible near the horizon. For a long while they didn't speak. They just looked upward, surrounded by darkness, but filled with light. Sophia pulled a notebook from her backpack, the one her mother had filled years ago with constellation sketches. She opened to the last page, which had always been blank, and wrote something. When Michael leaned over to see, she didn't cover it. She let him read it. Just a short sentence in her handwriting. "He was my North Star, but I know how to navigate now." Back at home that night, Sophia placed Max's tag in a wooden box, beside a photograph of him sitting beneath the porch steps, ears perked, eyes focused. She didn't cry. She smiled, just a little, and then she turned off the light, with Stella curling quietly at the foot of her bed. Outside, the stars remained, unchanged, undimmed, and waiting. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, made you feel something deeper, then don't let it fade here. Like the video if you believe in truth over silence. Share it if you believe stories like Sophia's deserve to be heard. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Because we're not done telling the stories they tried to bury. Your voice, your presence, your support, it keeps this fight alive. Justice doesn't end in a courtroom. Sometimes it begins with someone pressing play.